All right, let's get started. I'm reporting class today because some folks are not here, staying home to protect us from potential flu and other reasons to stay home. And we're going to need to be recording class because as we encourage people to stay home, if there's things happening in the classroom, then they need some access to them. Most classes, PowerPoints and the like will help. This particular class, which is going to be an introduction to the shift from the analog-based copper wire world to the packet switch-based of the modern computer world, requires some drawing on the board. And I wanted to try to record that so students who aren't here can follow along at home. The material that was assigned for today we will move into next week. You may have noticed that Tulane, Loyola, the other universities in New Orleans have shut down, moving to online. There will be increasing pressure for LSU to do that. I'm not certain when we will do that or if. Probably a pretty good chance on the if. So I wanted to get us started in case by Monday we've decided to move online. I'm also circulating the chapter from the new edition of the textbook. The chapters for those who are not here today will be with my AA, Cia Fox. There will be some additional chapters printed and available. You're going to need to pick those up, particularly in case we decide to shut down. You want to have them with you. Just sort of planning ahead just in case we move to online. Now, the microphone should pick me up fine. I don't know how well it'll pick up other folks in the classroom. So while we will talk about some of this, I'll try to repeat anything that's critical. Law and technology has the problem that the law takes a long time to grind into new solutions, and it's always lagging the technology. It's complicated when we're dealing with areas that Congress doesn't choose to deal with, either because of special interests or because it doesn't rise to their horizon, or more recently because they're just not. They haven't really been getting anything done for more than a decade now. Technology has been rapidly changing. We've not developed regulatory mechanisms to deal with it. We don't have a clue how to deal with issues of privacy, data access, or things like Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. This has raised issues of cyber attacks. We'll talk about those a little in this class. Right now we're going to deal with a more fundamental problem in that our Fourth Amendment law on dealing with electronic surveillance, which is becoming most of the surveillance we do nowadays, evolved during the period of copper wire telephones. Classic analog radio signals. And the notions of what it means to tap a phone are tied up in the notion that you have a physical phone. Right now, the Patriot Act amendments on surveillance that underlie bulk collection of data, wiretapping and the like for national security purposes, sunset on the 15th, this weekend. Now, Congress has not addressed whether they'll all be renewed, whether they'll be modified, whether some of them won't be renewed. As we'll see later in the course, there's a huge controversy over bulk collection because it's extremely intrusive and is proven to be almost useless. Now, my guess is they will with all the other things going on, they'll kick the can down the road and do a 6-month renewal. One of the key provisions in that is what we term roving wiretaps. You might have seen those in ACJ, but the traditional notion of a wiretap was not, you got it based on the person you were going to listen to, but it was tied to a physical phone. Well, in today's world, that's not a very useful concept. But that's an example about how we're tied to this physical phone, copper wire technology. Now, all of you live in the digital world, and some of you are probably way more advanced in the electronics behind this and the software than I am, but I'm certain for some of you this is just utterly magic. If I were to write an exam question about explain how your iPhone works, you wouldn't quite, other than I push buttons and things happen, you probably wouldn't get too far. So for those of you who are sophisticated with electronic technology, bear with me. And for those of you for whom this is magic, we'll try to do a little basics here. Question or just scratching your head? Okay. You can ask questions and the like. Key notion in the old copper wire world, you've got an old telephone here, and you want to talk to another old telephone. You basically had to be able to trace a physical link between those phones. Now, in the middle of this, there would be some sort of directory service which in the old days were operators, generally women, physical people sitting there. And so in an old phone system, you had a copper wire, ran to a pole outside your house, ran down your neighborhood, ran into a center where they put the copper wires into a bundle, and then they'd run them to the directory service. And when you wanted to make a call, you would crank the side of your phone, which had a little magneto, an electric generator, and that would ring the operator, and the operator would say, what number would you like to be connected to? And the operator would physically plug your phone line into a board that would either, if it was a local call, connect to another local subscriber. And imagine there's a couple of layers of this to deal with the big cities, but there's a human being in the chain. If you wanted to go across the ocean, you had to lay a physical bundle of wires to complete this copper wire connection. And it's one of the great engineering feats of all time. It's wonderful reading about the process of laying these cables. We still do this with fiber optic cables in the digital world. So you're going to continue to have this notion of a physical connection. Now there's lots of technology you can use to send different analog frequencies down the same copper wire, so that for these intermediate runs, say across the ocean, they could do what they call multiplexing, which meant that you could have more than one phone call on the copper wire. But the limitations of that technology meant you really couldn't have a lot of phone calls on the copper wire. In analog technology, you had the problem that the signal would drop off, just like if you were listening to an old-fashioned radio as you get farther and farther from the signal. And it would get garbled as it would drop off. So you had to have lots of amplifiers along the way. So this is hard to accomplish. It was expensive. Early days, certainly in the countryside, but even in the cities, you might be on what was called a party line. And there might be 5 or 6 people who shared the same phone line. And there'd be kind of a distinctive ring as to which person would pick it up. But if you were on a party line, I remember this, I would say from my childhood, but visiting my aunt who lived out in Wimberley, Texas, before it became a Delionnaire refuge and resort town, and was just still a goat ranch in the 70s and 80s, they were on party lines. And if you were talking on the phone and someone else on the party line picked it up, they could hear and join in your conversation. So we've got the physical connection problem, we've got the amplifiers, we've got the notion that if you wanted to tap a phone, you went in and physically attached clips to copper wires. Sometimes you did it as it came out of the house. Sometimes you did it at the switching center. Sometimes you could do it in the central. But tapping a phone actually meant somebody went out there and physically attached wires to the wires, and that drew current. So you had to be careful not to degrade the signal and make it obvious you're tapping the phone. And then you recorded that. It's an incredibly labor-intensive process. So we've got 2 legally significant characteristics of the analog world. One of them is from the earliest days, there was no expectation of privacy because you had human operators in the chain. You had people on party lines. So when the earliest court cases looked at phone calls, in fact, they found no expectation of privacy. And when we read our chapter on Fourth Amendment, we'll get more into that. But that's because of the nature of early phone lines, which don't resemble current phone lines at all. And I don't think any of you are old enough to really fit in the copper wire world. You only end up with our current expectation of privacy because Congress passed a statute creating a privacy right in phone calls. And then 20 years later, the Supreme Court says, hey, we've had a statute. People have now have an expectation of privacy. And now we have this sort of constitutional expectation of privacy, at least in copper wire phone calls. And that more or less moves over to if your current phone call is an analog to that copper wire, which means you're calling your cell phone in. To you, it looks like you're calling on a phone that could be attached to an invisible copper wire to some other phone. But when you obviously go to a VoIP phone and you plug your handset into the computer, is that the same kind of call? It's one of the issues that comes out of this. So as we'll talk about when we make the switch, we've got this. First, there wasn't any expectation of privacy. There's a statute, and then eventually you get an expectation of privacy under the statute that becomes a constitutional expectation. So that's something we're going to follow through in our readings about what's happening with modern communications. Have we gotten to an expectation of privacy in email yet? What about VoIP phones and other things? And we'll develop that in the reading. The other piece of classic copper wire technology is that it was really manpower intensive to tap phones. One of the key principles of privacy is that the best protection from privacy is that if it is hard and expensive to get the data. And that's why the digital revolution destroys your privacy, not because of legal issues or constitutional issues, but because it's cheap to get your data. In the 1940s, in the 1950s, if we wanted phone data on a bunch of people, and we wanted to tap their lines and listen to their calls, you were pretty much going to have maybe one agent could deal with 2 or 3 phones. Hugely expensive, logistically difficult to do, tied to the specific phone. So if your target went to, and I don't know, any of you seen an actual payphone? All right. Got a few folks have been to the sticks. Phones you put money in, coins, those round discs of metal, and you could call. Well, you couldn't tap that phone because you had to have had your alligator clips on the copper wire from that phone. If you wanted physical records, let's say you wanted somebody's office records, like Daniel Ellsberg, you had to break into the office and either physically steal the records, or you had to lay the sheet out one at a time and take pictures of them with your little camera. When Ellsberg wanted to steal the Pentagon Papers, it took him 3 months of him and his kids sneaking in and copying things on the copy machine. That made it extraordinarily expensive to do individualized data. If you wanted somebody's medical records, you didn't hack into their MyChart account. You had to break into the doctor's office or go into the hospital and impersonate a physician, which was incredibly trivial to do. But then you either walked out with the record, and they might even notice it was gone, although they might not, or you had to time-consumingly copy it. There was a whole world of miniature cameras. Minox made these wonderful little tiny cameras to take pictures of documents. Why does that matter? In a world in which it's really hard to invade your privacy, the court doesn't have to spend much time worrying about creating constitutional rights of privacy. So your privacy was pretty secure in the 1950s. But not because of the law, because it was so difficult to get information. 1972, in the race for president between Richard Nixon and George McGovern. George McGovern picked a vice presidential candidate, Thomas Eagleton. And there were rumors suddenly circulating that Eagleton had been treated for mental illness, which was the end of the line for political candidates in those days. And it took quite a while for his medical records to surface and show that he in fact had been given electroshock treatment for depression. And that was the end of him. And that was also the beginning of the phrase, when someone says they're behind you 1,000%, you know you're screwed. In our modern world, it probably would have been, 30 seconds if he'd ever been able to keep it secret at all. So we have real physical privacy and very little legal framework for privacy. So how does all of this change in the digital world? Any questions at this point about the good old days? If you see the old historic movies about the G-men and the like, You see how this plays out. You see them getting into phone exchanges and putting their clips on lines, copying records and stealing records. So let's erase the analog world, which is the world in which our law evolves, and the world in which several of our Supreme Court justices grew up. Now, when you're talking on the telephone, my voice is vibrating the air. It's an analog delivery mechanism. And if I were to put a sensitive pressure monitor in the air, otherwise known as a microphone, you would record a signal that looks like waves, and the waves have two important dimensions. How far apart are they? Are there lots of waves per second, or are there fewer waves per second? That's the frequency that I'm talking. Am I talking in a lower frequency, a tenor range? If I could do falsetto, which I can't, I would be talking in a higher range, a soprano range, and the waves would be closer together. The other is, how high are the waves? Am I talking loudly, or am I talking softly? All that information is coded in the frequency of my voice, picked up by a pressure sensor, which is a microphone. And the microphone translates that into an electric signal, which in the analog world, and analog just means the electric current is constantly on, and if you put waves in the current, like you put waves in this, an amplitude in the current, more or less voltage, to replicate this voice. So in the copper wire, the microphone turns it into an electric signal that, if we looked at the electric signal, would look like this, with our axis being frequency and amplitude, and it goes down the copper wire. Where we change is in the digital world. We take this signal and we turn it into a number. Fundamentally binary, 0 or 1, on or off. And we build up, we express the frequency and we express the amplitude in a whole series of binary numbers. And if you're an audio nerd, you know that you can get different qualities of recording depending on how big a number you use to encode the voice. So if you're listening to low-end streamed music, it might only be recorded at 16 bits, meaning that the number to represent it would be 16 binary digits long. If you're a high-resolution music buff, you might record it at 32 bits. Numbers twice as long, and the information about the quality of the sound it can record, the nuances in the variation and the frequency, goes up by a huge amount, depending on how many bits you chunk it into. The other thing is how many little pieces you chop this signal into. The more pieces you chop it into, the more accurately you can reproduce it. So you might be sampling it at 8,000 times a second, or you might sample it at 16,000 times a second, or if you want really high resolution music, you might sample it at 320,000 times a second, generating ever bigger pools of numbers. That's called the analog to digital conversion. Before we go any farther, you get this notion that we can take a continuous analog signal like voice, and we can chop it into a bunch of whole little pieces, and we can measure each little piece, and we can express that piece as a number. And we can take all of those numbers, put them in a file, take the file and feed it into a process that goes the other way. We do analog to digital to get to the numbers, and then we do digital to analog to get them back to the waves. So when you plug your headphones into your earbuds into your computer or into your iPhone, this stream of numbers goes back to a pressure device, a little diaphragm with a little magnet, and those numbers get turned into an electric current that moves that diaphragm, which pushes the air and reproduces the pressure in your ear that I originally created by talking. So when you're talking on your phone to someone else, your voice goes to the microphone, which is the analog to digital converter in your phone, turns into an electric series of numbers, and those numbers get sent to the other phone by ways of which we'll get to in a minute, and they get fed back into the microphone, which takes those numbers, turns them into an electric current, vibrates a membrane, and creates sound in your ear. Everybody good on that? I mean, this should be Digital 101. You all grew up with it. Where it starts to get interesting is, of course, that numbers are numbers. This could be the signal from a video camera expressed in numbers. So we could be recording a movie. I'm recording this class. The camera, the webcam is picking up the sound through microphone, picking up the video through a lens, an LCD, probably an LCD sensor or a CCD sensor. It's feeding it into the computer, which is turning it into a stream of numbers. And those numbers encode the audio signal, they encode the video signal. I could take a PDF file. Well, I can take a picture of a piece of paper, and I can scan that and turn it into a PDF file, which is just numbers. And those numbers don't look any different than these numbers. So the first piece of moving to the digital world is that all of your signals from whatever kinds of real-world devices, real-world observations, signal intelligence sources, come down to a common string of numbers. So let's remove these. next question is, we've got these numbers. How do we manage these numbers? In the early days of the digital world, there weren't standards for managing these numbers. So each piece of digital technology was a one-off. It created its string of numbers, it managed them its own way, it worked within the device. If you wanted to exchange it with other devices, you had to work out complicated protocols that converted one number representation into a number representation for other devices. That limited the usefulness of this, and it particularly limited the ability to share these numbers widely. So folks interested in moving a lot of data thought about how we should do this. And a lot of this work is funded by Defense Applied to DARPA, D-A-R-P-A, Defense Applied Research Program. DARPA starts after World War II to continue the funding of basic science that the government got into in World War II. And DARPA put a whole lot of money into basic science, and especially mathematics. Because mathematics underlies all of this cyber technology, all of this digital technology. And mathematicians are really cheap to fund because all they need in the old days were pencils and coffee. So in the late 40s, a group of mathematicians headed by Shannon comes up with what we call information theory. And that sets the basic rules for, if I've got this many bits, how much data can I carry? If I want to measure a signal and I want to reproduce it accurately, how many things do I have to chop it into? Let's do a physical, real world example of information theory. I want to know what is a 500-year rain event in Baton Rouge. What information theory tells us is that you need at least 2 data points to begin to define information. And so you need to look, if you want to know what a reasonable probability of what a 500-year rain event looks like, you have to look at 1,000 years of data. You have to watch 1,000 years, and you'd expect to see at least one 500-year event in there, maybe 2 500-year events. You always have to sample at double the frequency you're trying to measure. If I want to listen to music accurately on my headphones, and I want to get 8 kilohertz transients of really high notes and the interaction between the high notes, that might be 8,000 cycles per second. Those of you who are young could still hear that. I certainly can't anymore. But you'd have to sample it 16,000 times a second to accurately represent those. So what we know from information theory is that we don't have a clue what a 500-year rain event in Baton Rouge is because we don't have 1,000 years of data. We barely have 100 years of data. And so we make a lot of guesses. And there's lots of ways to make those guesses better. but we can't get past the basic notion of information theory, that we don't have enough information to make this. So one of the things that comes out of this is we learn how much data we have to collect, but we also learn how little we need to collect. If I'm just trying to listen to voice, I might not need to sample more than about 8,000 times a second, 8K. By the time you get to 4,000 hertz, you got most of the information in voice. So I don't need to do it as accurately, which means I can save bandwidth and I can save storage. So information theory gives us how big the numbers need to be and how often we have to measure them. So let's think about moving those numbers. That leads us to modern data transmission and the internet. Various visionaries projected into the future that we'd have something that would resemble the internet. Tim Berners-Lee, a couple of other folks, came up with the vision that actually led to the internet. And that was that the internet is not defined by its physical parts. It could be, you could run the internet through copper wire. You could run it through fiber optics. You could run it through microwave relay towers. You could probably even run it through a high pressure air modulated system. It'd be pretty slow. What defines the internet is the way the devices talk to each other and the way the data is coded into the devices. And that is TCP, Transfer Control Protocol, IP, Internet Protocol. You'll see TCP/IP all over the internet. TCP/IP is just a way of coding data to send it on the internet. So it can go from one device to another device, and the device sending it in knows how to code it, and the device getting it out knows how to decode it. And the key to the TCP/IP is the data packet. And hence my notion that we move to the packet switched world. Now, the notion of a data packet is that you want to send information down these channels, and the computer who's getting them needs to know how much information am I supposed to get? What's the content of the information? When are they done sending me the information? And how do I check that I got all of it correctly? Now, we didn't worry about that in the copper line world. If you got a little static on your phone call, you'd say, could you repeat that? And your ear would kind of decode the static a little. But in this world where we don't know what the data is, we have to be pretty precise. We're not decoding it on the fly. We've just chopped it up into bundles of digital numbers, binary numbers. Also remember, DARPA is funding this for one key objective. They wanted a reliable communication system for Armageddon. The internet comes out of the effort to create a self-repairing, redundant communication system so that if a nuclear attack took out significant parts of the communication network, the remaining parts would sort of automatically find a path through so we could keep communicating. In the copper wire world, you hit a switching center, that's done. Copper wire world is incredibly sensitive to disruption. So DARPA funds this system, and the notion is we want data transmission through an inherently unreliable system. How can we do that? So these packets, and this is incredibly simplistic, contain the address of where the data is being sent, they contain the number of bits, a start marker, the data, the end marker, and a hash code to verify the data. You don't need to memorize this, obviously. But it just says that I'm going to take that voice signal, I'm going to chop it into 10,000 packets. Each packet has a start and an end. Each packet is of a certain length, sometimes 128 bits, sometimes longer. And the packet tells, I'm the beginning of the packet's this long, the packet's going to this place, I'm packet number, which number I am. And at the end there, here's a number that if you run this mathematical transform on my packet, you should get this number. Now, it's a simple transform. It isn't that you replicate the data, it's just that maybe it's 1 or maybe it's 0. What it does is allow you to error check. Did the packet get screwed up in transmission? So the data comes to the other end, and they're receiving the packets, and the other end is picking them up, and it's putting them in order, and it's verifying them. And if it gets a bad packet, it sends a signal back saying, resend. So if you've got a low quality connection, it may have to resend a whole lot of packets, and things will be slow. But by the time you're done, you could get a perfect set of packets. That's completely opposite of the copper wire world, where if you get a degraded signal, there's no resending it and there's no recovering. So by chopping it into packets, you can have a low quality path and resend until you get it right. Now, part of the information that goes into the packet is, what is this? Is this a video signal? Is this an audio signal? Is this a document? Is this a document? Is this information from a temperature sensor? And all of these packets get mixed together going down the pipe. The wire, the fiber optic, the microwave tower, and they get sorted out in this system. So this is the first piece. This is, we turn things into packets, and the purpose of a packet is to be able to send the data in a reliable way through unreliable connections. And even our best fiber optics and the like aren't perfect. And trying to make them perfect would make them hugely more expensive and allow them to transmit much, much less data at a time. So by having some redundancy built in, some way to retransmit bad packets, we are able to move a lot of data through relatively cheap pipes. Pipe being the generic term we use for, we don't care how you're connected. Is it a fiber optic? Is it a coaxial cable from your old cable TV? Is it a copper wire? If you've got the old version of AT&T high-speed wireless or high-speed internet, doesn't matter what the transmission is. So that gets us to packets and the interchangeability of data. If you're just looking at a packet stream, you really don't know. It doesn't matter what it is when you transmit it. We good? So let's put these pieces together into the internet. So let's say you're sitting at home on your computer and you want to talk to LSU Moodle while you are hiding out from the flu next month. What does it take to get here? Well, you have a wire in the wall of some kind, and it's going to go to somebody who connects you to the internet, the ISP, the Internet Service Provider. That could be Cox Cable, that could be AT&T Wireless. There's other folks in there that rent space on the Cox Cable or AT&T, so you don't have to have them as your wireless carrier. If you're really hardcore, you might even be able to be your own ISP. But what the ISP does is it gives you an address, an IP address, an Internet Protocol address. And that's typically four base 12 numbers, hexadecimal. Now, my email address at LSU is richards@lsu.edu. That translates into a code that the directory can find. Let's say we want to go to the LSU website. We got lsu.edu, and then we've got sub-sites within LSU. All of these get turned into a unique address. And while we're discussing here, let's assume your home address has its own unique address. That's not actually true, but to your ISP has the address and it knows your address. And your address, your IP address, will tend to be consistent, but if you reboot your router, you might get a different one. That won't really be visible to you. So you can imagine that this 4 groups of hexadecimal numbers, base 12 numbers, that's a big number. But imagine the Internet of Things. You might have 50 different addressable things in your house. So this is IP4, and we're now moving to IP6, which adds 2 more. And once you get to 6 groups of hexadecimal numbers, you're beginning to be able to number the stars in the sky. So maybe we'll be able to deal with the Internet of Things. But the starting point is, if you're going to send something to somebody, they've got to have an address. So they've got their IP address. And you know where you're going to, the IP address of where you're going. So how do we get connected? Your ISP is connected to a router, which is everything. As we get out of your house, everything's a computer. So if I say you're connected to a router, which just means a computer that routes your signal along different pathways to the next router, these are just computers. And they're going to find the way to get to LSU. Maybe there's a direct link from this router to LSU. And maybe there's a link to this router in New Orleans to LSU. And maybe there's a link to this router to Chicago to LSU. And maybe there's a link from this router to Chile, to Florida, to LSU. Now these are not copper wires. So this is a path through to get to LSU. But when we go to Chicago, we can go to 100 million other places. Or we go to Chile, we go to 100 million other places. So imagine we have this worldwide network of routers connected together by all kinds of different wires, pipes, microwave terminals, submarine cables, satellites. So these are all, none of these are permanent copper wire connections. They're just data connections where you can trace a path through. Now, this router doesn't know necessarily where LSU is. So it looks in the phone book. Dynamic name server. These are the phone books of the internet. They take a hexadecimal address, and they figure out the way to get to that physical device that's identified by that address. So a couple of years ago, I changed providers for my personal website. And for years I'd worked with this Canadian company. And for various reasons I wanted to change providers. So I moved to a new internet service company. And one of the things I had to do was go into DNS and tell DNS that my address had changed. And this DNS server records it, and then through time, sometimes hours, sometimes weeks, this gets referred to every other DNS server on the internet anywhere in the world. So as you imagine, there's a lot of cooperation behind all of this. And it's all made possible by TCP/IP and then a group of other protocols. There's a protocol for sending mail. There's an agreed way of dealing with DNS. So if nuclear Armageddon comes, and this connection's done, and this connection's down, maybe I'm routing through Chile to get to LSU. Or let's say there's one of the things that the internet does with all of these paths is to dynamically reroute as traffic increases. So maybe there's a whole bunch of LSU students staying home all over Louisiana and greater South, and there's a bunch of traffic coming into the local router. And the things are slowing down. Well, maybe it'll start routing that traffic in other directions. So it dynamically adjusts the traffic. And if a node drops out, Katrina 2 comes in and New Orleans is off the map, it routes around New Orleans. Now, if you're in New Orleans, you don't get out, but data connections, or if you're in New Orleans and you can find a connection, it'll try to route you out. So, a couple of key things about this. Everything's a computer, and computers can surveil data and copy data without affecting the data. And they can do it incredibly cheaply. So if I want, let's say that we're talking about the router on the West Coast. It's sitting on the submarine cable from the Pacific. And I am the NSA. I could say, I want the feed from your router, which just means I want a copy of the data that's moving through your router. And they can copy all of the data. And it doesn't require 10 million agents in raincoats and alligator clips tapping phones. And the fact that it's a computer, none of the users would be able to tell. You could say, I just want to look at data from certain addresses. So that's the first change in the world. Sure, the computers are sophisticated and they're expensive, and the data storage to grab all the data from all the telephone calls in the United States is pretty daunting. But it's almost free compared to what it would take in 1950 to do anything close to that. So by having computers all through here, it's trivial to copy data, record data, filter data. That's piece one. Just keep in mind, everything here is a computer. Now, it also means these computers can be hacked. So if somebody can get into this router clandestinely, they can also grab the data. The U.S., Cisco, U.S. manufacturer, was one of the big manufacturers of this internet backbone equipment. And other countries have been very suspicious that Cisco has backdoors built in for the U.S. One of the fight with Huawei is whether all this kind of equipment that Huawei builds has got a backdoor in it for the Chinese government. And the computers and the software in them and the microcode, which is the software on the chip that allows it to talk to the software that you as a human see, are so complex it's difficult to verify these things don't exist. So these are potential structural flaws. The dynamic name server. If you can hack the dynamic name server, you can take substitute your own site for the LSU site and make it look just like LSU. Or maybe you could take a bank site or something else. Or you could just create havoc. You knock out DNS, you knock out internet traffic. So we have this complex web of physical connections and computers. We move data through it that's just zeros and ones. It's highly resilient. There was internet connection coming out of New York City after 9/11, even though there was a huge phone switching terminal knocked out with the Twin Towers. But because it's complex, and because it's all computers, there are ways into the backbone, and it lends itself to bulk collection of data. Bulk collection of data could be the metadata, which is the duration of your phone call, and your phone number and the phone number of the person you called, and your physical location, because if you're talking on a cell phone, they get physical location of where you are and the physical location of where your caller is. That's the metadata. That's really easy to capture. But they can also capture the whole data stream that includes the voice. That takes more storage. And that all can be recorded, and it can be scanned with computers that analyze that data, use data to speech, basically can read listen to the speech in these calls and look for keywords. That's part of bulk collection, and if it triggers something, an analyst like Snowden could go in and actually listen to your phone call. Now you can do this in real time as well, but you got to have people sitting there ready to do it, and you've got to have the calls flagged quickly by the computer, because you can't have 100 million analysts listening to all the calls all the time. So all of the effectiveness of this electronic surveillance depends on massive, fast computers, really smart algorithms to raise flags and identify things and route to humans to evaluate that intel. Yes?
Is it true that they can listen to your phone without you calling someone?
Okay, we had a question about, can they listen to you on your phone when you aren't calling someone? They can if they've been able to get malicious software onto your phone. And that's pretty easy to do. There's a lot of people download a lot of apps to their phone. They go to web pages that embed bad code into their phones. And there are apps that had good purposes but have unintentional backdoors that can be gotten into. Or if they can someone can get your phone, or just lure you to the right malicious website. It is absolutely possible to turn your phone's already a location beacon, to turn your phone into a listening post and turn your camera on. Now, that requires somebody taking the trouble to target you. But that's much cheaper nowadays than it used to be, because again, it's not an agent coming to your house and putting alligator clips on things. So your phone is just another computer on this system. It's much more susceptible to hacking, to tricking you into downloading spyware and the like than these routers are. And at that point, your phone becomes a listening device. Your webcam on your computer is actually more susceptible to that than your phone is. It's easier to get into your computer if you don't have good malware protection on your computer. I have an older webcam I'm using to record this. I could buy a fancy new webcam that has a little physical shutter that when I'm not recording, I can put it over, which is easier than putting a piece of tape over it, so people can't spy on me on my webcam. So the local user device has huge problems with hackability. The backbone is hackable, and that we get into that on cyber war issues. But it's also easy to do surveillance. So surveillance law is shaped by expensive surveillance in the 50s, in a world in which surveillance becomes free, and that administrative cost of surveillance is what actually protected our privacy. That's gone, and we're trying to recreate that through law. Question?
Like, what and who are we worried about spying on the average person?
So who are we really worried about spying on the average person? Well, we are worried that Russian hackers might be trying to get your credit card info. So there's the whole financial crimes world. They might even be trying to hit you, various malicious actors to hit you with ransomware, tie up your data, make you pay them for that. We're worried that state actors, North Korea does a lot of its government financing through cybercrime. And that's off institutions, but it can be individuals. We're worried that nation states might hack social media to manipulate your opinions about things. When our War College folks were here, we talked a little bit about the use of fake personalities on social media, bots, to shape public opinion. That's another form of hacking, and they're collecting data about you so they could better tailor the information. So even the notion of spying versus commerce versus sort of sinister public relations has gotten really blurred in this. And then there's the, well, what does it mean to lead a blameless life in today's world where you don't care if your whole life is on the internet? Now, a lot of people do live their lives on the internet. They probably have already given up their privacy, so they don't care. But if you're of my generation, and you were a college student when Operation Chaos and COINTELPRO were going, and if you went to anti-war protests, they were recording you and sending letters to the university to try to get them to throw you out. You care because of the dirty tricks. If you're concerned that you have unpopular political views and you're worried about the government, obviously this is China. This is a huge issue. Iran, Soviet Union. China, with the Great Firewall, sees the whole world of internet, cell phones, and everything as just sort of the larger part of the state spying apparatus. During the bad old days of the FBI did surveillance of civil rights workers, did dirty tricks. Maybe those days are all gone. Maybe they're not. What does a politically unpopular view mean? We have old examples, but we're living in a new world. It's really hard to fully understand. We're just now coming to grips with the value of manipulation of public opinion through social media. So a form of hack and a form of spying. Are the old things, the COINTELPRO, maybe they don't do that sort of thing. Maybe there'll be new things we've thought of. But for those of a certain generation, the idea of privacy is very ingrained, and it was driven by bad actions. You grow up in a world in which privacy is not even a terribly well-defined concept, where you're connected to the grid all the time, where you don't think about carrying the tracker with you. And even I, who believes in privacy, am not going to give up the cell phone in the modern world to try to reduce my presence on the grid a little bit. So that's the difficult policy decision we're all making. Think about all why do you carry a cell phone? Folks, Mr. Bua, why do you have a cell phone?
To just stay in contact with people that I need to be in contact with, or maybe to receive news or something.
Okay, you want to be in contact with people, you want to receive news, do you participate in social media?
A little bit, but not.
Okay, not more than 5 or 10 times a day.
No.
Look at the trackers on some people's phones. They may spend 2 hours a day on Facebook. We notice patterns that people are interacting less face-to-face, more through social media. Now that may be real important as we go into coronavirus Armageddon. What about shopping? Does anybody shop on their phone? Nobody shops on their phone? Yeah, we use phone for convenient shopping. How many times have you gone, God, I really need one of those, and whip out the phone, grab the Amazon app, and order it up? It's really convenient. I'm not sure anyone learns how to actually do physical book research. It's all, let's Google that. Which is sad, sad commentary, because Google's done. Google is interested in your buying stuff, not actually giving you information. If you go to Google Scholar, it's a little bit better. And then there's the devil's bargain on education, Wikipedia. Superficial, probably incorrect information on everything in the world. Huge amounts of biased, almost right information on important stuff. Wikipedia, probably a positive, but I'm definitely ambivalent about Wikipedia because it's a lot harder to undo wrong things people know than to add some new right information to them. It's changed the whole what it means to do research. And a lot of this is incredibly valuable. I can sit at my computer, you can sit at your computer, either through the VPN to LSU or on LSU, and you can read research papers, sciences, engineering, the arts, in ways that would take you months in the physical library of pulling the pages and reading and copying onto your note cards. That really facilitates the advance of knowledge. There's a lot of positives and negatives. But what we're really looking at is how the structure of this reduces the transactional cost for collecting information. Now, there's one more piece of this, and that goes to that IP address. And that is there's no verification. When the internet was designed, it was designed by some math and science geeks who thought everybody should be able to participate. There shouldn't be any barriers to it, which means that the backbone of the internet does not contain, the protocol does not contain any easy way to verify who someone is. And that becomes a core problem in cyber war. You can't easily tell where something is coming from. And you can't easily tell who is sending it. It's easy to spoof, S-P-O-O-F, addresses. You could look like somebody else's computer. You could look like somebody else's email. You could look like somebody else's country. Because all these different pathways can also be used to obscure the origin of information. And maybe we'll add a few more pathways into this. There's a network called Tor, the Tor browser. Tor. If you're interested in security, you want to run Tor. And Tor is called an onion router. Onion router because it sends, there's a bunch of folks who participate in the Tor network all around the world. And when I want to browse a site on Tor, I send my request to Tor, and it sends it. The first site knows who I am, but then it sends to the second site with none of my information, and then the third site, and maybe the fourth site, and then it comes back the same way, so that the information knows how to get from site to site, but my identity doesn't go through. And the site who's sending only knows they're sending to the first Tor site, they can't find me. So if I want to browse a site and not be traceable, I can use Tor. There's lots of variations of doing that. When you watch cybercrime movies, they're talking about, well, he hopped the signal all over the world. Well, that's effectively what you do. So just intrinsic looking at this, there's a way to print out the path the data takes if it's not going through an anonymous system. And you can see all the different waypoints. But those might be spoofed. So when we're in cyber war, we have to go beyond the structure of the internet to figure out where people come from. And there's ways of doing that, about actually trying to figure out what physical routers they went through, about combining it with old-fashioned physical surveillance, with other types of spying techniques. Because if you're going to decide that Russia has caused a power outage in New Jersey, and you're going to hit them with a cyber response, you really have to have a certain level, you want some high level of certainty it was Russia. When we look at our cyber war chapter, that becomes one of the key questions. In kinetic war, you usually have a pretty good idea who's shooting at you. Now, terrorism makes that more complicated. Who's taking responsibility for something versus who really did it. That just goes up to another level of uncertainty in cyber war. So one of the sort of long-term thoughts is, as we're doing things like increasing the address space to IP6, so we've got a lot more folks, should we be building a verification capability into the internet? The other piece of the internet is that everybody should be on it, but countries like China do not want their citizens to have free access to information. And because there are physical connections. The TCP is blind to them, but there are submarine cables coming into China. There are microwave links, there are satellite links. If you sit on the router on each of those links, you can create the Great Firewall. We hear a lot of talk about VPN, Virtual Private Network. That's basically a way to create an encrypted channel through the internet so China doesn't know it's you as a local citizen. But if they're controlling your local ISP, none of that works either. So at the same time, this has become a device for spreading information, for worldwide education. It's also become an incredibly effective surveillance tool. So if we look at China, which is essentially trying to set up their version of social media where you get ranked on your social worth, by how much you're a good Chinese citizen and bad things happen to you if you don't keep your social worth up. That was certainly not what the idealistic inventors of the internet had in mind. Right now, Russia is working to close their internet to the world. Iran has been working on that. So one of the things we're facing, will we see the balkanization of the internet, the breaking it up into different nation states, as countries use it for domestic surveillance and want to control information flow. Those are all interesting philosophical notions, and they will further complicate things like attribution. The more a country controls the backbone, the less you can trust, your attribution and your addressing. So that kind of gives you the gestalt of this huge disconnect that comes in the law based on expensive data collection, highly individualized data collection, hands-on data collection, to almost unlimited, although at an individual level it costs almost nothing to monitor you. Now for monitoring 1 billion people, that adds up, but it's completely doable. It's doable through technology. And the security things even hit the surveillance folks. Snowden, this more recent leaker who just got a mistrial, can take those same tools and pull the data out of the NSA. The NSA got hacked for some core hacking tools. That's created a industry in the United States has been very opposed to national cybersecurity laws that basically let the government regulate how they use encryption and require government backdoors, because separate from being spied on by the government, they do not believe the government can keep their secrets. And if there is a backdoor, someone will hack that backdoor. So we're much more vulnerable. We haven't talked about encryption, but obviously if you encrypt your email or your signal and send it through this, that's another layer of protection. And if you use good encryption, it's pretty hard to break. So, welcome to the Pack and Switch world. Questions? I'm not sure if I'll be seeing you on Tuesday yet, or at least in the flesh. We'll see. Pick up your handout.